Welcome to the podcast, everybody. The Intentional Creator Podcast with Dean Tucker and me, Jackson.
Jackson Thomas. You can't say my full name and then forget yours.
That's right. It's valid.
Do you have a middle name?
That's the K. Jackson K. Thomas. Jackson Keith Thomas.
Keith. Yeah, I did know that, but I forgot. Mine is Michael, so we both have pretty white middle names.
100%.
I feel like I have the whitest name ever, Dean Michael Tucker, especially in America where Tucker is like a first name as well. Like that was never something I thought about in South Africa. Like Tucker just seemed like a surname to me, and then I came here and people had their first name as Tucker. I was like, what is going on? And
that's kind of true about Jackson Thomas too.
Yeah, that's true. It's like even I've had some people call me Tucker by like thinking that that's my first name. And then it was a funny story I'll make this really quick, but on the van road trip, I got my van fixed, the alternator blew, and I went to this shop and the guy kept calling me Mr. Dean because he thought my surname was Dean and my first name was Tucker, and it was just really funny. Or I guess last name, as you say in America, not surname. That was another thing I had to get used to. Anyway, let's get into the actual topic at hand here.
What platform should I post on? What platform do I create on?
That's a difficult one. I feel like nowadays there's so many different platforms and there's this urge to be a part of all of them and spread yourself across everything and post your stuff everywhere. And like, even if you make the same thing, it's like expected to post the same thing on every single platform. But obviously every platform is geared towards different kinds of people and different kinds of content. So with that, where should you be posting your work?
Yeah, I don't know. This is honestly something I'm still really navigating in my own personal creative journey, especially with this intentionality, because I think there's different platforms are there for different things, especially algorithmically now. They're designed for different things. And so like really trying to like thread the needle in between all of the different kind of statistical input that there is really difficult to figure out like what actually is serving you first and foremost, and also allowing for your like truest form of your creativity to be alive and be online and to come out.
Also the audience's expectation as well, because like
right.
Obviously, a YouTube video is very different. This kind of video is very different from what you would see on TikTok or Instagram. But people watching this right now are expecting this content. They're like prepared for it, mentally prepared to be here for the long run, hopefully. Whereas on TikTok, somebody is there to consume short form content. So their mindset is completely different, and this just won't work. So yeah, you have to keep in mind the audience expectation and mindset as well when creating for specific platforms, which
is like immediately you're like already on a razor's edge with your creativity in that way, because it's like, okay, so are you thinking more about your audience now, or are you thinking about you still? Like how are you balancing that flow of output from your own innate creative inspiration while also taking into account the real things that are the social media applications that we all use, and how to apply them and how to promote them and how to express them online. It's a razor's edge, and I think it's really, really tricky to navigate. And I think for me, the biggest thing has just been like taking into account where I'm at in my life and what flows the easiest. Is a huge point for me. So in the sense of like, I'm definitely tuned into how to kind of quote unquote post on stuff like Instagram or stuff and things, but I'm also more tuned into what is flowing the easiest for me. Like I don't want, if there's any resistance in my creative field or my creative process, like I'm definitely watching that. And as soon as I feel any resistance, I try to either take a step back or get out of my head and just let it out, right? Let out some creativity that I've done that I may be overthinking about posting or whatever, or, you know, overthinking with the algorithm or overthinking with when I'm posting it. I think that's been like a really good way for me to kind of stay centered in that creative process of like, A, which platform am I posting on, and B, is my flow coming out in the smoothest way possible? Is it like happening the quickest and the easiest for my own creative journey? That's been something that I've just been using to like keep myself kind of like in that middle ground in between both those edges.
Yeah, I think knowing where you're at and your mindset and your own creative process, again, what feels comfortable and in flow and easiest, like the least resistance is going to allow you to create more freely and more intentionally and more enjoyably. Like you're going to have more fun if you are able to create in a place and in a way that isn't stopping you from doing the thing you want to do. I think another important question to ask is, I just made a list of questions right now. The first one is, where do you hang out? Like in terms of consuming and watching content, what has been your place where you discovered the thing that you want to do? So if you love YouTube, if you only watch YouTube and you don't watch any TV and like that's your thing, then you probably will be more inclined to want to create on YouTube because you understand the platform, you understand the dynamics, the trends, the audience, like all that kind of stuff. Even if you don't know it consciously, you know it subconsciously, as opposed to maybe you love live streaming, you love watching gaming on live streaming, and you hang out on Twitch and you know the community, you know how it works. Like I've used Twitch. I mean, I've never created on Twitch. I've watched on Twitch maybe like 2 or 3 times in my life, but that's just not somewhere that I hang out. So I wouldn't create there because I don't understand how it works and like what the norms are. And like, not that you have to, because sometimes it's good to not know norms, so you bring in a new form of creativity, but just to know the people that you want to talk to and vibe with, it's important to know the platform. So first of all, where do you hang out? I think both for me and you, it's between Instagram and YouTube for the most part, I would say. So that's obviously where we create the most, whereas someone might love Twitter or TikTok, and that's where they hang out there and that's where they create. So it's where you feel more comfortable, again, least resistance, and you feel like it's your like home, quote unquote. The second question that I wrote is, what do you like doing? So what is the art form that you have? If you're a writer, then maybe YouTube isn't the place for you. Maybe Twitter will suit you better, or Threads, or whatever it is now, like, or some other writing text-based social media app. Obviously everything is leaning towards more visual now, but even just in terms of like, if you are a designer, I mean, Instagram is obviously good, but maybe Pinterest, you love Pinterest, and Pinterest is a very underrated social media. There's a lot of reach, there's big audiences, there's very good potential for discovery, all that kind of stuff. And it's one that's not really talked about. Yeah, great for inspiration as well. Or you might like Behance. So there's a lot of other platforms that can serve you as well, depending on what you do. So figure out what platform works best with what you do. Obviously, if you're a filmmaker, YouTube is the best place for you, or Vimeo. Like, again, even in that, just depending on what kinds of films you make. If you're really into very high production, commercial, documentary, more, yeah, I guess it's more on the high production quality side, Vimeo would be your hangout spot. But if you want to build more of a relationship, more of a community, then YouTube is more inclined to gear towards that. So
I think too, the other part of it is like, you know, the creative process is going to grow, and don't hold yourself to one specific output in your head. You know, let that creative momentum grow into whatever it might bleed over into. Maybe you start as a photographer on Instagram and then you transition to doing video, and
which is both YouTube, what we did.
Yeah, exactly. Like just allowing your own creative spark to be guiding you in those processes, and then be using the platforms at hand, and not being resistant to the new platforms and trying different things. Allow it to kind of come through and try.
I think see what's interesting to you as well. If a new platform or space or audience or a topic seems interesting to you, then explore it. And that might be your thing, but you don't know until you try and see if it works for you. But even in doing that, if you do try it, like me, I've tried almost every social media platform, and I can say that Twitter and Threads is just not somewhere that I like to be, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just not a platform that I feel resonates with me. So that's fine. Even with TikTok as well. Like, I post on TikTok and I use it, but I don't really consume and spend time on TikTok, and so that's not my main focus. So, but I just followed the interest to see what it was about, and I tried it, and only through doing that I was able to see if I liked it or I didn't like it, I think. And then my third question was, where is your target audience, or the people that you want to connect with? Where do they hang out? So I think this is kind of goes in line with where do you hang out, because if you're doing the thing that you're interested in, those other people will be there as well. But if you're a filmmaker, most likely filmmakers are going to be also hanging out on YouTube. If you're a writer, most likely writers are also going to be hanging out on Twitter or Threads. And so where's the people that you want to connect with? Go start creating in those spaces and drawing those people to you. Because, like, even not in terms of like the very surface level of filmmaker, writer, if you're a filmmaker and you want to make really long form conversational videos, even stuff like this, we don't necessarily want to be posting this on TikTok, because the kinds of people that we're trying to attract are people that can stay and watch a 50-minute video because they have the attention span to do that. And again, not that we can't post shorter clips of this on TikTok as well, but if we purely focused on TikTok, we wouldn't necessarily be able to have the depth that we have in these conversations and be tapping into the audience that we want to be talking to. Does that make sense? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's definitely a big part of the social media game, is knowing who's receiving it. And then, keeping that balance between who you know is receiving it and finding that edge of like how much you're creating for them and how much you're creating for you. So if you have a general way of output, writing, speaking, video, this is a visual content, photo, whatever, audio, finding your specific outlet of expression, and then finding that rhythm of flow with that, and just to let the creativity or whatever is coming through you to come out, and then just continue to move and navigate from there as you find that like rhythm that you're in.
I also think it's okay to be spread out over different platforms and and be multifaceted, because, and like, this is something I struggle with all the time, is I have so many different interests, and I'm like, how does this all fit together? And in one of my channels, like if I were to do everything in one place, it just doesn't really make sense. Whereas like to have a space to do this podcast on Spotify and here on YouTube, which is like this channel is dedicated towards these longer form conversations. It gives me a place and a home for this part of myself. And that feels really good, as opposed to the videos, my adventure videos on my YouTube channel. So it's okay to have those different parts of yourselves and have platforms for different things and different purposes. If you are that kind of person that does feel like all over the place, like I do.
So maybe there's just so much coming through. You got to have these different outlets of expression for these different kind of veins of your passion.
So I don't know if you do still, but I know when Threads came out, you were using that pretty heavily for a while. Do you still do that, or?
For a second, and because I was appreciating how the bridge was happening with Instagram, but no, I'm not in it like that anymore. It kind of tapered off, and it's too short form. Like in the sense, if I'm realizing that if I'm in my thoughts, if I'm in a writing phase, I want to write. So there's been a lot of stuff I've been writing, but I haven't necessarily published it or posted it anywhere. I'm kind of building out a blog site vibe right now, but the short form content isn't. I recognized and learned this when Threads came out, and just kind of recognizing and bouncing off of this idea of Twitter. Like, I really like to write, but I really need an outlet of longer form writing content for my thoughts to kind of just go, instead of thinking I've only got 150 characters to do whatever I want to say.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like something I learned through that process of being on Threads and interacting with that kind of shorter form writing content. Granted, it's still great, still usable, and once I kind of find that output of maybe the longer form, I could use that threads to promote it,
summarize,
or talk about little snippets from the whatever I wrote, and that could be really helpful and useful.
But yeah, it just didn't flow with your creativity and creative outputs. It hindered you instead of enabling you. Yeah,
I was having to close down the thoughts because they had to be short versus like allow the thoughts to grow and let them do what they wanted to do in the words. And so that was like definitely something interesting I realized about shorter form writing content, which I definitely think is like in a lot of ways right now, we're so short term focused in a lot of things. So allowing like the creativity to really just channel and like come out is like something I've been working with.
Yeah. So find a platform that allows your creativity to flow.
Which is kind of, this is great, like in that way. There's an element of that, like, oh, this can just keep talking, we can keep going, we can work through the conversation, we can work through the idea. And I think I really enjoy that about podcasts and talking, is because there's no like time limit necessarily on what can be expressed, what can be worked through, what can be talked about. So,
So on the idea of short form content and shorter writing, you are posting a lot of short form content right now and creating around that. Even it's still, I would argue it's like more mid-length for you because you do like longer short form content than the average. But yeah, why? Yeah, what you're doing on Instagram and like even on TikTok as well, where you have your like time lapses, but you're speaking for a minute and a half, 2 minutes, whatever, or even sometimes 3-4 minutes, which is cool. I like it. So that's kind of the gap. But my question is, why have you chosen the platforms that you're on, and how does it flow with you?
I think absorbing, right? I think that my creative flow right now is really, I mean, and you know this, my creative flow is very hand in hand with where my life's at right now. So in the sense of like, I'm really having to learn how to focus the creativity that's coming out of me. And so a lot of the content places that I'm posting on and I'm engaged on is because I'm like honing in on what my creativity is trying to say. So TikTok, for example, is definitely part of that. Like I'm honing in on what is wanting to come out of me, what is wanting to be expressed in me in the sense of emotionally and physically regulating the body. That's something that I've been really deeply involved in my whole life, but is becoming more and more conscious in my system of like, whoa, there's a regulation that needs to happen between these systems in my body. So that's kind of a space for me to just kind of be exploring that idea creatively without necessarily having the need to have pressure or any sort of external input necessarily. You're on it, a couple of my homies are on it, and then there's like, I think I got like 20 followers on there right now. But the space itself is just for me in that expressive, like building that relationship with myself and building my relationship with it around that content form for me. Because there's multiple edges in it for my own creative system, which is another reason I love using different forms of content to kind of push into different creative edges for yourself. And then photography's always just been like something that I'm really in tune with in my just life. I'm always kind of taking photos and always capturing moments. And that's definitely always how I've done it. You know, I'll go through my life. I'm just living my life, either going to work or meeting cool people at a party or at some friend's house or doing whatever, and maybe just capture a moment, capture a little scene that I love, that I see. It's really in line with street photography in a lot of ways, but it's more towards emotional like scenes that I can visualize and capture where I'm like, wow, that's a beautiful moment for them. That's a beautiful moment for this either couple or this. I recently was at a show shooting somebody who was running the sound, and he was like dancing the whole time while he was running the sound. And so I captured this little shot of him like vibing to the music that he was helping to create, because it was just this awesome little present moment that I was just like, wow, that's so cool that he's like so into this. And he's just like dancing.
And also most people don't capture that either. So that's a cool, unique viewpoint that you have.
Yeah. And I don't know why. That's just part of like who I am as a creator, I think. Like that's just part of my blueprint, and how I create is very much just like loving life in a lot of ways. Like that's really I just have so much love for life and all the experiences of it. And so
Instagram is the place for that.
Instagram is the place that I kind of have that expression and have that place of like outreach and putting ideas out there, putting moments out there that I've like been through or captured and that kind of thing. And I still wrestle with that all the time in the sense of like, okay, this is kind of a place I need to be a little bit professional on, but also this was just a vibe, even though I shot it in like my phone and low light, so it looks trash, but it was great. And that's definitely something I have to work through as a creator in my own life, of just like, I have very little barrier to entry as to what the quality needs to be. If the moment was a vibe, we love it. You know what I mean? But that's definitely not how like the algorithm,
other people perceive it. Yeah.
Professionalism likes to feel.
Because I think there's also a challenge that comes in when, say for example, you're posting the content you're on TikTok, and it's like, well, why don't I post that on my Instagram as well? Because I already have an audience there that knows what I'm doing. So
yeah, and I'm definitely leaning into that, and like definitely pulling, starting to feel through how that wants to look. And I've kind of gotten more honed in on what I'm trying to say and what I'm expressing on there in that integration that's happening. The more I'm feeling excited to start to share that on my Instagram, because I think it's needed, especially right now. And so that's definitely an inner kind of journey that is a relationship with everybody, and it's part of this conversation. It's part of this intentional creative conversation in the sense of like, how am I showing up intentionally in all these different ways for myself, while also being intentional about how I'm sharing my message and how I'm being of service to the world and what service I'm offering. Because I definitely see social media and content creation in a lot of ways as just as a service. I'm just offering my perspective. I'm offering where I'm coming from, and people can see that and they can run with it. They can, it can mix in with all their ideas and stuff like that. So yeah, that kind of inner dialogue in my system is something that I'm definitely always kind of navigating with, where I'm sharing stuff. Like where is this coming from? Where is the share coming from?
And then obviously you still are a filmmaker as well, on top of all the other things. So how does YouTube fit into this? Because you kind of started with Instagram and YouTube simultaneously, but you did very well on YouTube and like created a lot of content and art and films around that. Whereas now it's not as much of a focus. So maybe the question is like, how do you choose where to focus your energy on which platforms?
It's a great question. It's something I'm navigating constantly with myself.
Yeah. Well, just answer from where you're at right now.
Where I'm at right now is the fact that like, and even in this podcast and in this dialogue, I have to be intentional how I answer this. YouTube is a long form content. YouTube is long form sharing, right? And how that lands for me, especially nowadays, is very much something where I want to be sharing ideas. And so I don't necessarily have time right now because of where I'm at and what I'm working in the sense of like financially, like making money. I've got to be making money, and I don't necessarily have time to be like going out every week and making films. Yeah. There's a lot of variables there. It's not just the money thing, but that's definitely something that I'm like going to be refocusing on this year, which I'm excited about, and simplifying the films that I'm making. But then the other part of that too is on the YouTube platform, how am I focusing and what am I focusing on in the sense of the idea? What idea am I sharing? My mind feels so expansive in so many ways that I can lose track of myself and where my creativity is if I don't have something to anchor myself in.
Yeah. Like this, for example, I think that's why this format works, and having the one question, and like we speak about this, and like even before this podcast, Jackson mentioned like doing a couple of questions. I'm like, or let's just focus on one so people know what they're coming for and what to expect. Because I think with this long form content, it is difficult not to get carried away, and I feel like we do sometimes in this podcast, but that's part of the same conversation. And this is also meant for that, whereas like this is specifically a long form conversation podcast style, and that's what people are expecting, whereas for a YouTube video, not necessarily. They might not have as much leeway to watch an entire hour video of you rambling on about a million different things. Not that it's not important what you might be saying, but I think people, again, it comes to the expectation. When people click on your video, they want to know what they're getting out of it.
Well, and again, and that's really at the end of the day where my relationship to YouTube is in the sense of like, I want to be a focused creator in a lot of ways. That's an intention of mine in my creative process. I want to be a focused creator. What am I focusing on? What idea am I sharing? What concept am I working through? And it's taken me a lot longer than I actually thought it would to get integrated, in the sense of like to bring in what concepts and what ideas that I really want to center around for myself in my own like verbal and visual creative process.
Yeah, me too. I'm only finding it now after 10 years, really.
Right. Like it's actually, I mean, there's so many different distracting things in the sense of like where visual content can go, that I feel like I definitely, and that's not to say that that's wrong, that's needed in the process of growing visually, but I feel like I definitely got lost in a lot of that, and I had to learn how to pull it back and understand its place, but also understand that I had to be coming from an intentional story for my own creative enjoyment, like for my own creative kind of like, what is the analogy? The jewel that you're kind of like carving out of the mud, right? To stay centered around that kind of like point that's coming through you. So honing in on that, focusing in on that is that kind of razor's edge in this creative process in the modern age of making sure that you're not necessarily just getting lost in all the trends and all that sort of stuff.
It's coming back to your why. It's coming back to why are you doing this? What is the message you're trying to tell? And not just being a creator or an influencer to be an influencer.
Right. And that's definitely locking in for me now. It's just a matter now of like, okay, cool. I've got a much better picture of where I'm coming from and what I'm bringing to the table. Now it's just a matter of like production style, right? How am I encapsulating this idea, putting into a production strategy, quote unquote, and taking it into a place of like producing and publishing.
And at the same time, keeping in mind what you want to do and how you want to express yourself versus what's easy to consume and easy to understand that idea.
Right.
It's just all a balance, and the Venn diagram of them coming together is like the place to be. But it's difficult to find that. Maybe that's a whole nother episode as well, is like finding the balance between creating for you versus creating for your audience. I think that could be a good episode.
I'm going to write that down.
Yeah, add that to the Google Doc. We have a Google Doc with all of the questions we have for this podcast and like different episodes we want to make. We must have about, I don't know, 40 to 50 questions now. So we have tons of things to talk about. And every time we get on, it's like this episode is going to be a little bit shorter just because Jackson has to go. But we're like, what's a short question here? Like, all of these can just be so long and so intense and get so deep, even though on the surface it seems like such a simple question. But it's almost more this might be a stretch, but like this is almost a philosophical podcast about social media.
I mean, you're 100%. I think you're right.
Do we put this in the philosophy category?
Yeah. It's such an edge for me because I think my mind totally slips into that philosophical realm of it all so easily.
Yeah.
But then at the end of the day, I'm like centering around the why, centering around the intention, centering around the question.
Well, it's interesting because the whole point of philosophy is that there is no answer, which a lot of these questions don't have a concrete answer. So, and I'm like, does anybody speak about the philosophy of social media? There's got to be some people doing it, but I haven't seen it. It's definitely not mainstream. Everyone's talking about the strategy and like the game plan and how to hack social media, but no one's having these questions.
Right. Which is like actually it's just like you're lost in the sauce. Not to say that the sauce isn't bad, like you run the sauce, be in the sauce, whatever. But like, there's also this other question outside of it of just like, wait a minute, where are we at? Like as a biological being around this thing that is social media. I think that's a really important question. Like you're saying, the philosophy behind it. Like, where is it coming from? Where is it taking us? What is it doing for our growth?
I got to add philosopher to my website bio.
To the podcast bio, for sure.
Oh, for sure. We should change the bio to a podcast about the philosophy of social media.
Well, and I think it's so funny though because it all really is wrapped up, encapsulated in the title, the intentional creator. Like I feel like I keep coming back to that even in this conversation. I was just like, well, what platform do you post on? You're just intentional about it. What do you what do you want to presenting, and just be intentional about how you present it. You can do writing stuff on Instagram. You can do painting stuff on, you can do all this stuff that you need to do via any of the platforms that are alive, other than maybe Twitter and Threads, kind of. That's a very specific. But the other platforms really just determine around the intentionality behind it, where it's coming from within your system. Mm-hmm. And also your awareness of all the different, trends and like you were saying at the beginning. Yeah. Or just like what makes sense for you, what flows out for you. But again, it just comes back to that intentionality.
Mm-hmm. I just got another question, which is, should you follow trends or not? That's another episode.
That is another episode. That is what that is right there.
Yeah. I feel like we've kind of wrapped up this one. I'm happy with everything we've spoke about. I feel like we answered the question both philosophically and practically. And yeah, I feel pretty good about it. I think Jackson and I have been so excited about this podcast and about the potential of it and where it can go. And we just have such big dreams and hopes and plans for the future. I mean, we're just taking it day by day and step by step and one episode at a time. But we really believe that this is so much bigger than just being a podcast. It's so much more than that. It's almost like, dare I say, a movement and like something that can really change the world. And we were speaking the other day, and like, we don't want this to be about us. It's not about me, Dean, as a person, or Jackson as a person. It's about this idea of being intentional and being conscious about what we're doing on this planet, and
facilitating that into the creative flow that we are all a part of, especially in the West. We're all part of these creative endeavors, and we're all trying to monetize them. We're all trying to create some sort of like stability through our creativity, which is amazing and totally, needed and desirable. That's the new Earth. That's the place we're going to as a species, I think. But it's like, how can we have to...
How can we do it in a healthy way and sustainably as well?
Yeah. And not to get lost in the idea realms. I struggle with this all the time. Like, I get so lost in the ideological spaces of the ideas that I have, the things that I'm thinking, the creative output that I want to put into, which is awesome, and you definitely need that. There's a place for that. But at the same time, like, I also just need to stay grounded and make sure rent's paid. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, I've still got to just do the work of being human and living in this society and just doing the things that I need to do to take care of it and make the moves in the sense of the conversation at large of, how we're engaging with the planet and other countries, and how we're taking care of like recycling and all those sorts of things. It's all
and like you said, it's a conversation. Like this podcast is not necessarily meant to give you one answer or one way of doing things. It's not a 5 hacks to get more followers podcast, and you just get chills from hearing that. But yeah, we want to create community around this idea. And so we're even speaking about doing live streams in the future and like scheduling times to have people come on and like be a part of the conversation and a part of the chat. And I know this is still very early days in this channel, this podcast. And there's not that many people listening to it, but for those of you that are, thank you so much. We hope to include you and have you be a part of this.
Well, and send exactly. Like, send questions. Or
leave a comment in this video. That's the easiest way.
Right. Leave a comment on the video. Ask questions. DM us. Like, it is a conversation. It's a conversation, and any sort of input. Because the more I tell people about it, every time I tell people about this, what conversation we're having, it's really cool because everybody's got their own opinion on it. Everybody's got their own perspective. They've got their own questions about it. They've got their own, like, in the sense that most podcasts I'll talk about the Joe Rogan podcast, and people are just like, oh, what was Joe Rogan talking about today? And it's a little less about what Joe Rogan's talking about and a little bit more about just like Joe Rogan's doing his podcast. And so it feels cool to be part of and kind of like instigating the conversation. So yeah, ask questions that we should talk about. Ask questions that you're curious about to help us like round out where we're coming from and what we're even doing.
Because these are just the questions that we've come up with from doing it for 10 years, but that's our vantage point at 10 years of doing it. Like, we aren't a beginner anymore, so we don't know what a beginner is going through in the social media landscape today. We started in 2014. and it was completely different then. So your perspective is unique and important.
Well, you may not even be in the social media landscape, and that's a great perspective too.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
To hear that kind of vantage point of like where it's coming from. So
yeah,
cool. We good?
I'm excited. Yeah, I feel good about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Thanks for joining the Intentional Creator. We'll chat to you in the next episode, whatever that is about. We don't know yet, but we'll figure it out.
Chat to y'all soon.
All right. Have a good day, everyone. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.